What happens when political fire meets comedic gasoline? What if a late-night host invites a culture warrior into the lion's den, but isn't ready for the roar? On that night, the air in the Ed Sullivan Theater was thick with anticipation. Lights dimmed. Applause signs blinked to life. Stephen Colbert, ever smug and smiling, was prepping for a segment he knew would draw heat. His producers were giddy. This wasn't just any guest. It was CharlieKirk, founder of Turning Point USA, conservative commentator, and perpetual thorn in the side of liberal media. The audience didn't know it yet, but this segment wasn't going to end with a handshake and a chuckle. It would end in chaos. Backstage, Charlie was calm, focused, flipping through notes he didn't need. He knew what Colbert was capable of: slick jabs wrapped in satire, crowd priming disguised as monologue. But Charlie had come prepared for more than a debate. He'd come for war. His assistant warned him about the crowd. "It's not your turf, not your people." But Charlie didn't flinch. "That's exactly why I'm here," he replied. Minutes before the curtain rose, a segment producer approached with a tight smile and a looser promise. "We'll keep it civil." Charlie smiled back, but his eyes stayed sharp. He'd been told that before. Colbert's opening act was vintage late-night bait, mockery of conservative politics, a few pointed barbs at pro-life arguments, laughter on cue. Then came the setup. Our next guest is no stranger to controversy or to making headlines for all the wrong reasons. The crowd chuckled. Charlie walked out greeted by a wave of applause tinged with skepticism. He sat, squared his shoulders, and stared down Colbert. They shook hands, but it felt like loading the first round. And just like that, the trap was sprung. Neither man was walking out of this the same. The moment CharlieKirk settled into his seat, the tension in the studio grew sharp enough to cut. Stephen Colbert leaned back, legs crossed, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Charlie," he said with a mock casual tone, "you've been busy defending the unborn and offending just about everyone else." Laughter echoed. Charlie's jaw tightened, but his voice was even. "If defending life offends you, maybe that says more about your values than mine." The audience's laughter died down, replaced by an uneasy hush. Colbert grinned wider, already sensing that Kirk had come loaded and wouldn't play along. Colbert pivoted, pretending to ask about Kirk's latest college tour, but laced the question with sarcasm. "How does it feel to tell a bunch of 19-year-olds what to think about women's rights?" Charlie didn't blink. "It feels like correcting years of ideological indoctrination," he shot back. The audience booed. Charlie didn't look away. He glanced at the crowd, then locked eyes with Colbert. Maybe if more of them heard both sides, we wouldn't be in a culture that celebrates abortion like it's self-care. The room shifted. Some clapped, others jeered. The mood had turned confrontational, and they were only 3 minutes in. Backstage, producers whispered frantically. This wasn't going as planned. The script had projected light tension and comic relief. Instead, they were watching an ideological collision erupt in real time. Charlie's assistant stood at the edge of the wings, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "They wanted fire," she muttered. "They're getting a wildfire." Colbert, sensing the heat, tried to steer the conversation back into humor. "Let's not get too dramatic," he said, chuckling nervously. "It's just a uterus, not a battleground." Charlie leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. "To some of us, it's not a punchline. It's a life." And the audience, once loud, suddenly went silent. Stephen Colbert shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on the desk like a man trying to regain control of a ship mid-storm. "So, Charlie," he said with forced levity, "you believe life begins at conception. Does that mean tampons are now a war crime?" The audience laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Charlie's stare didn't waver. "If that's your level of discourse," he said, voice flat, "no wonder we're losing the moral thread of this country." His tone wasn't angry, just cold, surgical. And in that instant, the power dynamics of the studio began to shift. Colbert, clearly irked, leaned in. "So, no exceptions? No compromise? Not even in cases of rape?" His voice had an edge now, the comedian mask slipping. Charlie's reply came fast. "You don't punish a child for the crime of the father. That's not justice, that's vengeance. A sharp gasp ran through the crowd. Colbert opened his mouth to retort, but Charlie kept going. What I'm saying may be hard to hear, Stephen, but morality isn't measured by applause, it's measured by truth. Colbert laughed, but it sounded thin. And you get to define that truth? Charlie's voice cut through him. No. Biology does. Behind the cameras, a producer's hand hovered over the cut to commercial signal. Another whispered, "He's hijacking the segment." Charlie's assistant whispered back, "No. He's exposing it." On stage, the tone was turning. Colbert tried to pivot again, make a joke, break the momentum, but the audience wasn't quite with him anymore. Some were shifting uncomfortably, others just watched silent. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was confrontation. Charlie didn't look at the cameras, he looked straight at Colbert. "You invited me here to play the villain," he said. "But maybe you didn't realize your audience is starting to recognize the script." Stephen Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly rattled, his eyes darting toward the floor producer. He was losing the room, and he knew it. What was supposed to be a comedy segment had turned into a cultural powder keg. CharlieKirk, composed and calculated, adjusted his mic and spoke directly to the crowd. "You laugh because you're uncomfortable," he said, "but that doesn't make the issue any less serious." His words weren't fiery, they were firm, and that made them land even harder. In the third row, a woman crossed her arms and nodded slowly. Colbert tried to reset. "Let's just remember, this is a late-night show, not a courtroom," he said with a strained smile. "People come here to laugh, not be lectured." Charlie didn't miss a beat. "Maybe that's the problem. We've laughed ourselves into moral numbness." A ripple went through the studio, the laughter had evaporated, and the usual late-night rhythm was broken. The audience didn't know whether to cheer, boo, or sit frozen. Colbert reached for a punchline, but Charlie leaned in before he could speak. "You joke about things some of us consider sacred. That's not comedy. That's cowardice." Backstage, the control room was a frenzy. "Cut now?" someone asked. "We let it go a little longer," the director muttered. "It's ugly, but it's viral." Charlie's assistant paced near the curtain, watching the show turn from entertainment into ideological warfare. On stage, Colbert gave a forced laugh, but there was no echo from the audience. "Well," he said, "I guess we're not getting a Christmas card from Turning Point USA." Charlie stared at him, unamused. "Maybe you'll get something better," he said. "A wake-up call." And just like that, the theater sat in stunned silence again. Stephen Colbert flipped through his note cards, searching for something, anything, that could steer the conversation back to familiar ground. "Let's talk about your new book," he offered, grasping for safe territory. CharlieKirk didn't bite. "We can get to that," he said. "But if you're inviting me on here just to use me as a punching bag for your audience, you should have been honest about it." The words hit hard, flattening whatever lighthearted momentum the show had left. Colbert's mouth tightened into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Colbert tried sarcasm. "I just thought we'd have a friendly chat about the joys of forced birth," he quipped. The audience gave a few uncertain chuckles, but even that sounded strained. Charlie didn't flinch. "That's a grotesque way to frame it," he said. "And you know it. You're smart enough to understand what you're doing. You just hope no one else notices." There was no raising of voices, no shouting match. But it felt like a courtroom cross-examination. The lines between host and guest, comedian and pundit, were blurring fast. The energy in the room was brittle. The producers exchanged tense glances. This wasn't the segment they'd rehearsed. One of them whispered, "He's gone off book." But Charlie hadn't gone off book. He'd just torn theirs in half. Colbert shifted tactics, trying to regain the upper hand. "You're here because people disagree with you, Charlie. That's the whole point of discourse." Charlie shook his head. "No, I'm here because people are afraid of having their comfort challenged. And apparently that includes you." A stagehand stepped forward with a signal, but no one moved. The show had become something else now, raw, real, and irreversible. Colbert's expression hardened. The polite banter was gone, replaced by the simmering tension of a man who realized his home turf was slipping away. "Charlie," he said slowly. "You're not some kind of martyr. You're just a guy with a mic and a lot of bad opinions." The audience clapped, relieved for a second to hear something familiar, Colbert swinging back. But the relief didn't last. Charlie cocked his head. "If disagreement makes someone dangerous, then maybe it's not me you're afraid of. Maybe it's the truth." Colbert let out a low laugh, the kind meant to disarm. "Truth? You mean the version that fits neatly on a bumper sticker?" Charlie leaned forward, voice calm, almost whispering. "No, I mean the one that says human life has value from the moment it begins. You can mock it, but deep down you know what abortion is. You just don't want to say it out loud." The air tightened. Even the band, usually ready with a light cue, sat still. Colbert's smirk twitched. "That's your truth, Charlie. Not everyone agrees." Charlie replied, "Funny how disagreement only counts when it's in your favor." Backstage, the director asked again, "Do we pull it?" The executive producer shook her head. "Let it burn. This'll trend for days." In the audience, the division was visible now. Some faces angry, some thoughtful, others stunned into silence. A woman in the second row whispered to her husband, "He's not wrong about all of it." On stage, Colbert adjusted his posture, clearly trying to reassert dominance. But Charlie didn't flinch. The segment was off the rails, but he wasn't trying to steer it back. He was steering straight into the fire. Stephen Colbert tapped his pen against the desk, his usual rhythm now broken, his jokes landing flat. "You know," he said, "you remind me of someone who yells fire in a theater, then acts surprised when people panic." Charlie responded without missing a beat. "No, I'm the guy who sees smoke while everyone's laughing and asks why no one's looking for the flames." The audience reacted, but the laughter wasn't coming. Murmurs replaced chuckles. Somewhere between entertainment and argument, the room had become a courtroom, and the jury wasn't sure who was winning. Colbert tried again. "You talk about protecting life, but what about the women? What about their autonomy?" The question came sharp, clipped. Charlie's answer was slower, deliberate. "You don't protect rights by denying others theirs. The unborn don't get to speak for themselves. Someone has to." A few audience members clapped hesitantly. Others stayed silent. Colbert raised an eyebrow. "And you're the self-appointed spokesman for them all?" Charlie looked him dead in the eye. I just refuse to pretend they don't exist." Colbert opened his mouth, but nothing came. The room held still, waiting. Behind the scenes, a lighting tech whispered, "This is brutal." A segment writer muttered, "We've lost the punchlines." Charlie's assistant stood by the monitors, arms folded, a slight smile on her face. She knew what her boss was doing. It wasn't just rebuttal. It was exposure. And Colbert? His armor, wit, charm, crowd control was cracking. He straightened in his chair, reaching for the next card on his desk, but fumbled. The crowd didn't laugh. They watched. The lights felt hotter now, and for the first time all night, Colbert looked uncomfortable in his own house. Colbert dropped the card on his desk, letting out a breath that wasn't meant for laughs. "Charlie, do you honestly think you're going to change anyone's mind by coming in here, hijacking the show and sermonizing?" His tone was clipped, frustration leaking through the sarcasm. Charlie leaned back cool and unfazed. "I'm not here to win applause. I'm here to say what no one in this room dares to, and judging by the silence, it's working." The crowd rustled, a mix of discomfort and intrigue. A man in the front row shook his head, but didn't boo. He just watched. Colbert turned to the audience. "This is what it's like when you let the internet come to life," he said with a weak grin. "A flood of algorithms and outrage in a sport coat." Some chuckled, but it was the laughter of a room trying to reset, not reward. Charlie shrugged. Better that than a host who hides behind jokes because he's afraid of conviction. The audience let out a collective gasp. Colbert stiffened, hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Conviction," he repeated. "That's rich coming from someone who's made a brand out of yelling into echo chambers." Backstage, the stage manager glanced nervously at security. "Not yet," the director said, eyes locked on the monitor. "It's still contained. Barely." But it wasn't just a television segment anymore. It was ideological trench warfare. On stage, Charlie pressed forward. You think you're the referee here, but you're part of the game, and the rules, you've rigged them. Colbert sat still, blinking. The audience, once a wall of predictable support, had fractured. Charlie wasn't winning them all, but he was making them think. And that, in a space built for applause, was more dangerous than silence. Colbert leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. You talk a lot about truth, Charlie, but do you ever stop to ask yourself, what if you're wrong? The question came not as a jab, but as a challenge. It hung there, heavy. Charlie didn't blink. Every day. That's why I don't run from hard questions, but your show doesn't ask questions, it mocks them. The audience reacted, a few claps breaking through the silence. Colbert blinked, surprised. The applause wasn't for him. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to rattle the cage. You think I mock truth? Colbert asked, his voice tightening. I think you confuse accountability with persecution. Charlie leaned in. And I think you confuse popularity with righteousness. His tone was even, but the blow landed hard. Colbert laughed, short and sharp. Is this the part where you quote scripture and wait for the lightning? Charlie smiled faintly. This is the part where I tell the truth and watch who can handle it. The crowd sat still. The studio, usually a rhythm of jokes and applause, had turned into a space where words carried weight, and silence meant more than laughter. Behind the curtain, the executive producer was on the phone. Yes, it's spiraling. No, we're not pulling him, yet. The control room was silent, but for the buzz of equipment. Everyone watched. On stage, Charlie glanced at the camera, then back to Colbert. You brought me here hoping I'd lose control, he said quietly. But I didn't. You did. Colbert opened his mouth to reply, but paused. The timing was off. The confidence wavered. In that moment, he looked less like the master of ceremonies and more like a man whose own stage had turned against him. Colbert sat straighter, his jaw set. You come on my show, challenge my integrity, and expect to be treated like a guest? His voice was louder now, the facade of wit replaced with irritation. Charlie didn't flinch. You invited me. Did you expect a monologue puppet or a real conversation? The question struck hard. Colbert paused. The audience was caught between tension and fascination, the kind that holds people in their seats long after they stop clapping. Charlie leaned forward slightly. If you can't handle pushback, maybe you shouldn't invite people who push back. Colbert's smile returned, but it was brittle. You don't get to hijack this moment, Charlie. This isn't a town hall, it's a show. Charlie nodded slowly. Exactly, a show. Where morality is set dressing and applause is currency? The crowd murmured. Someone near the back clapped once, then stopped. Colbert glanced toward the band, then at the producers off stage, silently asking for a signal. None came. The director wanted this to play out. It was no longer about content, it was about control, and right now Colbert was losing it. Backstage, a crew member whispered, We've never seen him this off balance. Charlie's assistant stood near the curtain, arms crossed. She could feel the shift too. On stage, Charlie settled back into his seat. You said you wanted an honest discussion, he said, but the second it stopped being easy, you reached for the exit. Colbert clenched his jaw but said nothing. For a man known for his quick wit, he was suddenly out of words. The audience waited, the cameras rolled, and the silence said more than either man could. The center of gravity had shifted, and Colbert could feel it slipping away. Colbert exhaled slowly, his voice sharp now. Let me be clear, you're not the victim here. You came to provoke, not participate. Charlie didn't argue, he simply nodded. Sometimes the truth feels like provocation when you've built a platform on denial. The line landed like a stone in a glass room. The crowd stirred again, unsure whether to applaud or recoil. The control booth watched in silence, eyes darting between monitors. Colbert was losing the narrative, and everyone behind the scenes knew it. You're grandstanding, Colbert said, tone clipped. You come here, disrupt, and then pretend you're the adult in the room. Charlie responded evenly. I'm not pretending, I just refuse to sit in silence while you dress ideology in jokes and call it journalism. That was it, the moment the temperature broke. Colbert slammed his hand on the desk, not hard but loud enough to jolt the room. The audience gasped. A few people actually flinched. Charlie sat still, his expression unchanged. "If the conversation's too real," he said, "maybe the platform isn't as open as you say." Backstage, a producer raised a hand. "Do we cut?" The showrunner's voice cracked through the headset. "Number, let it run." Security had already started moving closer to the stage, just in case. On camera, Colbert was visibly flushed. He stood up. Charlie stayed seated, unmoved. "You wanted fireworks?" Charlie said quietly. "You lit the fuse." The crowd buzzed with confusion, discomfort, and electricity. It was no longer a show, it was a reckoning. And everyone, audience, crew, network, was caught in the center of it. Colbert stayed standing, glaring down at Charlie, who remained seated with an air of deliberate defiance. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or hold its breath. "This is my stage," Colbert snapped, "and you don't get to sit here and act like you're above the format." Charlie looked up at him, calm and composed. "Then maybe the format needs to change," he replied, "because the truth doesn't come with a laugh track." It was quiet. Too quiet. The audience was no longer sure whose side they were supposed to be on. One of the producers off stage finally gave the cut signal. The screen faded to black for commercial, but the cameras kept rolling. Charlie stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. Colbert turned his back to the desk and began talking with his team, voice low but agitated. "I said don't let him monologue," he hissed to a nearby assistant. Charlie, overhearing it all, spoke loud enough for the crew to hear. "They didn't want an interview. They wanted a piñata." The stage manager looked away, unsure whether to intervene or let the segment die on its own. As the music played to mask the tension, Charlie walked over to the edge of the stage and stood facing the audience. They stared back, some confused, some impressed, others still waiting for a punchline. Colbert didn't re-engage. He was still off stage, hands on hips, fuming while network execs debated what to do. No one quite knew what the next beat should be. The script was gone. The act was over. What remained was a room full of people who had just watched the curtain fall, not with applause, but with confrontation. When the cameras came back from commercial, the set looked the same. But everything had changed. Colbert returned to his desk with a clenched jaw and a forced smile. "We're back," he said, his voice tight. "With CharlieKirk, for now." The audience chuckled uneasily. Charlie stood near his chair, arms folded. He hadn't sat back down. Colbert gestured to the seat. "Are you planning to join us or just campaign from the floor?" Charlie stared at him, then slowly stepped away from the chair instead. "Maybe I've outgrown the furniture," he said. The crowd stirred again. Colbert's grin vanished. "Then maybe you should leave," he said, his voice sharp and final. Charlie tilted his head. "Are you kicking me off your show because I refuse to play the clown?" Colbert didn't respond immediately, but his silence was answer enough. The audience gasped. Some clapped, others booed. The moment was thick, historical, and irreversible. A producer stepped toward the stage. Security followed close behind. Charlie raised his hands, not in surrender but in clarity. "It's your house," he said, "and your house doesn't want dissent." Without another word, Charlie turned and walked off stage. Cameras tried to follow him, but the director cut the feed. The audience buzzed with energy, some shocked, others emboldened. Colbert sat at his desk, hands clasped, trying to compose a close. "We'll be right back," he said, voice faltering. But he wouldn't be. Not really. The control had shifted, and nothing, not applause, not editing, not even network spin, could put it back in his hands. The clip hit the internet before the credits even rolled. Raw, unedited footage of CharlieKirk's exit flooded social media, gathering millions of views within hours. Hashtags exploded. Charlie vs. Colbert, Late Night Meltdown, and now Free Speech Showdown all trended by midnight. Twitter lit up with debates. Some praised Colbert for holding his ground, others condemned him for silencing a guest. "He couldn't handle dissent," one user posted. "So he did what cowards do. He pulled the plug." On the flip side, progressive voices cheered, calling it a much-needed stand against extremism. The nation had picked sides, and there was no middle ground. Inside the CBS studios, executives scrambled. Crisis meetings were called. PR statements were drafted and redrafted. The show's official account posted a carefully worded message. Stephen Colbert remains committed to challenging conversations even when they get uncomfortable. But the damage was already done. Leaked texts from crew members painted a grimmer picture. The control room was in chaos, one wrote. We weren't ready for a total breakdown of the format. Internally, producers were divided. Some blamed Colbert for losing his temper, others blamed the booking team for inviting Kirk in the first place. Meanwhile, CharlieKirk released a short video from his hotel room. No studio lights, no makeup, just a phone camera and a clear message. They didn't want a conversation. They wanted a spectacle. And when I didn't give them one, they showed who they really are. It was a strategic masterstroke. The clip went viral. His base rallied instantly. Even those who disagreed with him politically began to raise questions about censorship, control, and the role of media in framing truth. The late-night bubble had burst, and now the aftershocks were beginning to spread. Backstage, after the show wrapped, the atmosphere was bleak. Colbert sat alone in his dressing room, head in his hands, a half-finished glass of scotch on the table. The usual post-show debrief had been canceled. Producers filtered out quietly, avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to tell him the truth, that the network was furious, the audience was split, and sponsors were calling with questions. One executive had already issued a warning. This isn't just a bad segment, it's a reputation risk. In the writer's room, the team was in shock. Some argued they should have pulled the plug earlier. Others said the confrontation had gone exactly as expected, just more volatile. One junior writer said what no one else dared. We brought him on for fireworks. We got fire. That line would be repeated in newsrooms for days. The line between controversy and collapse had been crossed. Even the crew, hardened by years of live tapings, agreed. They had never seen anything like it. Across town, Charlie's team celebrated quietly. No champagne, no press tour, just a quiet confidence that the moment had been theirs. He didn't flinch, his assistant said, scrolling through headlines. He didn't blink. And they folded first. Charlie reviewed clips in silence, studying every word, every reaction. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "They tried to bait me." But the trap turned inward. He knew the moment was bigger than the room it started in. This wasn't just a show gone wrong. It was a culture war flashpoint. And he'd walked out holding the match. The next morning, the headlines were brutal. CharlieKirk ejected from late night. Colbert meltdown on live TV. Free speech or provocation. Networks scrambled to reframe the moment. Some clipped the segment into sound bites, editing out Colbert's worst reactions. Others played the raw feed, letting the chaos speak for itself. Pundits lined up to weigh in. Conservative outlets hailed Kirk as a martyr for the pro-life cause. Liberal commentators tried to downplay the moment, calling it a planned stunt. But few could ignore that Colbert had lost his grip on the narrative. Talk shows devoted entire segments to the clash. Morning anchors debated whether Colbert had gone too far or not far enough. It's not about abortion anymore, one analyst noted. It's about control. Who has it, who keeps it, and who crumbles when it's challenged. The incident had exposed something deeper, the limits of civility when beliefs collide. And viewers, hungry for authenticity, weren't satisfied with scripted outrage. They wanted real stakes. And this time, they got them. Uncensored, uncomfortable, undeniable. Meanwhile, Colbert's team braced for ratings reports. Initial numbers were high, explosively so, but network brass knew the risk. One viral moment could mean millions in engagement. Or long-term credibility damage. In contrast, CharlieKirk's following surged. His video responses gained traction not just in conservative spaces, but among independents who felt alienated by media theatrics. He didn't just walk off a show, he walked straight into a cultural moment, framed by a single, unanswered question. What happens when someone refuses to play by the script and still wins? By the end of the week, the divide was undeniable. Colbert's loyal audience doubled down in support, praising him for standing up to extremism. But behind the scenes, his team was reeling. Advertisers began quietly backing out of future spots. One longtime sponsor issued a vague but telling statement: "We support dialogue, not disruption." The incident wasn't fading, it was evolving, becoming a litmus test for free speech, media integrity, and how much ideological confrontation an audience could stomach in a late-night format. CharlieKirk, meanwhile, was capitalizing with surgical precision. He appeared on podcast after podcast, framing the clash as a deliberate attempt to suppress dissenting views. "This wasn't just about me," he said in one appearance. "This was about millions of people who feel mocked, silenced, and shamed for what they believe." His reach expanded. Independent commentators who typically kept their distance from culture war debates began defending his right to speak uninterrupted. The moment had slipped from Colbert's control and into Kirk's narrative. Inside CBS, the fallout continued. Colbert's next monologue addressed the controversy briefly. He made a few self-deprecating jokes, but the crowd response was lukewarm. The laughter felt cautious, controlled, scripted. His usual confidence hadn't returned, and neither had the full trust of his audience. The moment had cracked something open. Late-night TV had always lived on the edge of satire and safety. But now, the illusion of control was gone, and in its place stood a question that no punchline could erase. As the news cycle began to shift, one thing was clear. The clash between CharlieKirk and Stephen Colbert wasn't just another viral skirmish. It had become a cultural fault line. In a time when shows are polished, conversations rehearsed, and reactions pre-programmed, this moment cut through the noise with raw discomfort. Charlie didn't just challenge Colbert's questions, he challenged the entire format, exposing how quickly platforms crumble when confronted with something they can't spin or contain. Colbert returned to form weeks later, but something had changed. The crowd laughed on cue, but the edge was duller. The interviews felt safer, the risks fewer. Guests were vetted more tightly, and unspoken boundaries tightened. Meanwhile, CharlieKirk continued to ride the wave, invited to forums, college campuses, and interviews by hosts who now understood what he brought to the table. Disruption that couldn't be dismissed. He had walked into enemy territory and left with the microphone still in his hand. So, what do you think? Was CharlieKirk justified in standing his ground? Or did Stephen Colbert just underestimate the fire he invited on stage? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit that subscribe button, and tell me who you want covered next. This isn't the end of the conversation. This is just the start of a reckoning.